are going to look forward to you updating us on considerations with barn designs and how to handle our barns.
Okay, so first I apologize. I do have a cold, so I'll sound a little funky up here. Like Josh, I also live on a farm. We do sell some hay, not that much. But if Josh ever falls out of academia, he has a career building hoop barns with me. So, maybe in the future you'll see us out there as a crew working for you. You never know. There's always time in the future, retirement goals. There's a lot of types of barns out there. A lot of barns you can buy. A lot of barns you can put up yourself. And so I really want to just sort of touch on what I think are major concepts, but I'm not like promoting one type of barn over the other. You'll see on my front slide that I have hoop barns for round bale storage. I find them to be the most economical, but certainly if you're doing square hay, that doesn't make any sense at all. You'd be far better off with a pole barn. And it really depends on your operation and how you're managing your hay as to what you really need. You can always retrofit old barns. You can always add sheds. You can always have metal. You can always have metal barns, hoop barns. I don't know how they got the hay in like this. Don't ask. There's not a good solution. Don't do that. Unless you have lots of time on your hands and you were just looking for fun. Creative solutions. And then, of course, the square hay there in a metal-sided pole barn. One of the big things that I think a lot of people don't spend enough time on when they're thinking about a hay barn and putting up a new barn is the site selection for it. I see a lot of barns that are not in the right spot, or there's not enough space around the barn to turn around trailers and equipment, where the barn is in a low spot because that's where the drive was. And then all of a sudden you have all that water coming off of a hillside, and on a year like this, you know how much water comes off the hillside and ends up in the bottom of your barn, and you don't have enough rock and it doesn't drain properly, right? So that's a big problem. Drainage is critical, access is critical, and building separation, I put this up there because of fire risk. This is a trade-off. If we put enough space between our barns for fire management to make sure barns are protected from other barns and that we can reduce the risk of fire spreading between barns, we have a lot of space between our barns that we have to then mow and manage or spray or gravel or do something with, which is a real big pain. So you have to make that decision yourself and how you manage your risk as to how close together you want your barns to be. We want to avoid low spots and steep slopes. We want the water to drain away from the barn and access area. And it's actually a pretty steep slope that's recommended from moving away from the edges of the barn back to the ground. 5% slope. That's not a slope that I really want to drive my tractor on. That's a fairly steep slope that we're looking at here. And we're diverting runoff away from adjacent areas. So if we do have gravel areas next to our barns, we don't want the water from those gravel areas also running into the barns. We want to make sure that's all sloped away as well. For access, we want to plan for convenient access. That means we need to be close to our roads. We want to avoid having a lot of gates because when people are coming in and buying on a cache hay, if you're only delivering it, maybe you can handle your own gates yourself. But if you're selling hay and people are coming to pick it up, gates are not necessarily your friend. They make more work for you. On the other hand, no gates means no security. So there's a trade-off there as well. And then you also need to keep in mind your distance from your hayfield. So setting up a convenient spot for people to purchase hay might not necessarily be the same spot that your hayfields are at. So you need to kind of balance those two things because when you're trying to beat rain, which as Josh just said, we had to beat rain a lot of times this year, distance from the hayfield can be a critical component to making that happen. We want security from fire and from theft. There are definitely people that will steal hay. We need to have some sort of security, lighting, other things like that on the site. Preferably it be visible from a house. Those are things that we really want for the security of our product. And we need roadways and turning areas to allow ample space for trailers, bale wagons, things like that. 75 by 125 feet is what is recommended. That is a very large gravel pad. But if you've ever seen someone turn a trailer that doesn't know how to drive a trailer, you know why you need that much space. I have a area this large and actually a little bit larger. It's about 100 foot wide and about 250 feet long. And I still have people that drive continuously off of the edge of the gravel when they turn because they don't know where their trailer turns compared to where their truck is. And I'm sure I know other people that have to put up barriers to try and keep people off their grass. And that's reality. But you need a pretty large area and be able to turn your equipment, and especially if you're bringing in bigger trucks, full-size semi-trailers, be really conscientious that you're giving them the space that they need, because the last thing you want them to do is back into the side of your barn that you just invested a lot of money in. Plan to accommodate the heavy equipment. That means you have the all-weather access. You got to have your filter fabric down and build your drives properly, larger rock and then smaller rock on the top, because that's what's going to hold up to the heavier equipment and the bigger trucks. I know sometimes people just throw another load of rock on the drive year after year after year, which is fine. A more cost-effective solution is to build the proper drive the first time and not have to spend that money year in and year out, hopefully. Don't build it right now in the mud. As a side note, this is not the correct time of year to be building a new driveway. Wait till it dries out. It'll be a lot easier. So spacing is that compromise between safety and practicality. 75 feet between barns is actually a pretty large amount of space. And honestly, even at 75 feet, if the fire really goes hot, I'm not sure that you can stop the next barn from going. You know, some people will say 50 feet between barns is enough. Only if you've got good water supply nearby, and in some rural areas that's not possible. Sometimes you're pumping from a pond and someone can get it. Sometimes you're trying to get it from city water at the end of a line and you can't get enough pressure, and you're just hoping that they have enough tankers coming out to keep the next barn from going up. And that's reality. You should know, you should know where your water sources are in the case of a fire, because when they come out there, they're not going to be as prepared as you are. That should be in your contingency plans, is to know where that water source is. And if there's not a good one available, you should be telling them when you call that there's a fire, so that they can be prepared to start bringing water with them, enough of it. Does it make sense? Barn sizing. This is one of those really big challenges, is sizing the right size barn. And I think this is really site specific. You need a certain amount of space in the building, a certain footprint to hold the amount of hay you're looking to do. One of the things that I think is sort of interesting is how people type or grade their hay will determine the size and layout of barns that you need. So if you're a person where different fields have to go into different bents or things like that, you might need more smaller barns to be able to access all that hay at one time, or you need to have the barn oriented in a little different direction so you can access a lot of areas on a barn. If you are a first in, first out, you just need to set up the barn to be able to put the hay in the way you want to and pull it out. This is very much dependent on how much hay and the types of hay that you're doing as to how you're going to lay this out. I know I sound like I'm dying. I might need it eventually. And then the storage capacity. You're always going to want to have more storage capacity than you need, but you're basically paying for the barn. That is an upfront cost, and you have to cost it out over how much hay goes into it. So if you oversize your barn too much, you're going to have a hard time paying it off at the right time, or you're going to have to pay too much per bale that goes into the barn, and you're going to sort of price yourself out on the storage. As a rule of thumb, if I'm figuring out my building space for square bales, I need about 10 to 15 square foot of footprint area per ton of square bale that's going into a barn, and about 16 to 24 square foot per ton of round bales that are going into a barn. These are very rough estimates. The size, the shape, different things, how high you're stacking, things like that will all influence this number. But just as a rule of thumb, that gives you an idea if you're trying to figure out how many square feet you're targeting, because next year you're going to increase by 100 tons. This will give you an idea how many square feet you need to have in storage to maybe get to that number. It should give you a rough idea. For 5x5 bales, when you stack 3 high, you only need 10 to 12 square foot per bale. When we stack only 2 high, we're at 15 to 17 square foot per bale. So that's sort of an indication of how that height makes a major difference in the bit. So again, how do you manage small squares, large squares, round bales? How many bales? Are you grading? Are you cutting different fields? Are you accessible from both ends or from multiple sidewalls? This is something I see a lot of people struggle with, is that they have set up all these really nice barns and they only have access from like one end. More so from hoop barns where I see this. Most people that put in a pole barn typically can access both ends because there's typically a sliding door on both ends, and they typically put a drive around the whole barn. But with hoop barns, people will put in a large hoop barn and only have access from one end of the barn. From an efficiency standpoint, when we go to a 96 or 120 foot long hoop barn, for example, we spend a lot of time in our logistics bringing bales in and out of that barn because inevitably that's a long barn to move in and out of. So if I'm trying to move hay in the summertime, that can be a challenge. If I can get access from both ends of that barn, I can be much more efficient. Also, I could use the barn for then 2 grades or types of hay. So really thinking about that early in the process and that siting can make a major difference. So this is just an example of a 5x5 round bale storage capacity in a 32 by 64 pole barn, a 36 by 64, 42, and then a 48 by 64 foot. This 64 foot long barn, really we're going to lose 4 feet on it because the 5x5s don't take 64 feet, they take 60 feet to stack in that barn. And it has all of them stacked on end. But it just gives you an idea of how much access you have, how many bales you can store based upon having side access versus an end wall access. So how you orient your bales and how you set them into the barn will affect how much hay actually fits, which is kind of interesting to play with. Also, barrel stacking bottom bales on round bales will change the number of bales you can fit in a barn typically as well. Certainly on the 5x6s and the 4x5s it does. One of the rules of thumb when sizing your barn is if you're going to stack 3 bales tall, these are 5x5 bales, you're going to need about 14 feet to get all 3 bales stacked up. If I was putting in a barn like this and I wanted to stack round bales into it, I'd put another 2 feet at least to the bottom of the truss, because inevitably I will hit that truss with my equipment if I don't give myself adequate space to move stuff in and out. Same thing with square hay. I still need at least 2 feet. I should have at least 2 feet between that bottom bale and that bottom of the truss. I see a lot of hay stacked right up on top of that truss. If you're hand moving that hay out, it's not a big deal, but most of you are looking to mechanize your system. You're going to bring in a grapple or something like that. You need space there so you don't destroy the structure. And so 2 foot above the top stack of hay is really important. Same thing here. If I go to a 6 foot diameter bale, all of a sudden I'm almost to 19 feet from floor to truss clearance to get that hay in that barn. So now I'm actually costing myself into a fairly high level because it costs quite a bit more to have my eave height on a barn above that 16 foot mark. So I'm really going to be playing with my numbers here if I'm siting a barn and trying to fit it into a space for 5x6 bales. If I want to give myself enough space to make sure I secure those trusses, it can be a big difference. Construction tips. So these are just things that I would suggest as you are having someone build a barn or working on that you really think about pretty early in the process, and make sure that you harass your contractor if things are not going the way you're hoping. The floor and base. Compacted gravel's an option. Geotextile under compacted gravel is a much better option. Even though you may not think you're moving a lot of equipment in and out of the barn, you're going to run equipment in and out of the barn a lot of times. Putting that geotextile under the gravel will really maintain the gravel life. And when the ground gets soft like it is this year, that mud will work up amongst the rocks and it will actually cause the rock structure to break down quickly. Excuse me. And we really, really don't want that because that basically destroys the structure, but it also allows the water to wick up into the bales more easily. Keeping that geotextile on the bottom won't allow that soil structure to come up amongst the rock, which will strongly expand the life of the gravel in the barns. One thing I do see quite a few people do is put compacted gravel down and then put shipping pallets, rough boards, planks, something like that over the top. It will help with wear and tear on those bottom bales. It is a lot of labor to move it in and out. So if you're moving a lot of bales all the time, it might not be feasible to be moving pallets on the bottom. But if you can't figure out a market to sell bottom bales, you may have to consider something like this to protect those bottom bales to get the value out of them that you need. So that's really a site-by-site decision. Concrete floors will hold up the best of all, but they can still sweat. It does not mean that your bales will be protected from moisture, and they're very expensive. That is not to say, though, that they are not the easiest to clean out if you're trying to get loose hay out every year. If you do have issues, there's some real value in having the concrete there. Plus, you know, it's a lifetime guarantee, basically, that spot's going to stay a barn, probably. Realistically, most people, if a barn comes down over concrete, a new barn goes up. So you got to be pretty committed to that site if you're going to do that. And one of the things I do see some people do, although less now, is put a layer of loose hay on the ground or just not clean up the layer of hay from last year. That's not a terrible solution as long as the hay isn't holding water. If there's any moisture in the barn, that hay on the ground is not a great option. But if the barn is dry, it's not the end of the world to have a little bit of loose hay there. But it very much depends on your situation. I would prefer to see it moved out because any organic matter that makes it into the rock gravel base is going to eventually turn into dirt, which is going to then hold moisture amongst your rock. This is just an idea of how the floor base construction is going to look. You're going to have geotextile on the bottom, and then you're going to have a rock layer. What you can see here is that the ground is actually significantly lower, about 12 inches lower than where we're actually driving in the barn. If your barn isn't 8 to 12 inches higher inside than the dirt outside, the typical ground outside, you probably need to evaluate whether or not you need a little more dirt in your, or rock in your barn, rock in your barn. You also really want to make sure that this area on the edges of the barn is sloped away the way it needs to be, which may take some work over time. And putting rock here will really help because that's where all that water's hitting the sides, and it will typically erode out right there. So putting some rock there to protect that so it doesn't just make a big ditch right beside your barn is a good option. If you have the time and the energy, it is better to start with a layer of larger rock and then put smaller rock. Inside a barn, I would accept just smaller rock as long as it's at least 8 inches thick. But certainly for the drive areas, you want to do large rock and then small rock. This is probably the biggest challenge that I see is people will put hay up against sidewalls. And I am not fully a structural engineer, I just teach a class on it occasionally. But post-frame construction does not expect a load, an outside leaning load on the posts of a barn. The barn is not designed to handle that load. It's not built to handle that load. It is what will cause failure in that barn. Steel barns are maybe a little better equipped to handle the load, but they desperately need extra girts if people are leaning their hay out against those posts. Girts being the members that go across the barn that the metal siding is drilled into. This is what I hope not to see, where you put your hay here and then you put this extra layer here on the outside, so that it's leaning against the barn, and then you add some extra wood over here just to make sure that there's something for it to hit so it doesn't take the metal off the side. That's not a good solution. So if that's your storage solution, we need to talk. You can see here, this other picture here, this barn wall is actually bowed out. So this is one where they have a sidewall opening and their end wall is actually closed and the wall is bowing. That is just a sign that the barn is not going to last the lifespan that you expect it to. It's going 6 to 12 inches there, so yeah, those added boards, they're not a solution. You still have a problem. And the last sort of construction thing I want to point out is that hay barns, and we'll talk about ventilation next, but hay barns are typically partially open. I'm dying, thank you. Are typically partially open, and as a result of it, they have a lot of wind load on them. And the wind loads are not necessarily even. So if I have a completely closed barn, and my wind blows from the left-hand side for you guys here, and I got my posts 8 foot on center, which is a pretty typical pole barn, and these walls are all closed off here, I will have upward force of almost 2,000 pounds on each post. I have some downward force because I've got the weight of the roof coming on it, so they kind of counteract each other, but I still probably have some upward force on that barn. 40-foot wide barn. What happens, excuse me, if I take one of those sidewalls out? All of a sudden, I have almost 6,000 pounds of upward force on the posts on the side that doesn't have sheathing on it, and 3,000 on the other side. So if I'm going to put in a hay barn, I really want to be conscientious of the fact that my posts have to be embedded in the ground correctly, and my trusses have to be sized and noted for an open-sided building, because that's how I actually get a structure that's going to stand up to the wind, and I'm not going to lose my roof and or my post when we get the 50-mile gust. For the post embedments, a foundation will resist the vertical and the lateral loads, which is good because it will help if you decide to roll your hay onto your sidewall and then your post bows out. But it also is really important for that wind load we just talked about. They shouldn't be less than 4 foot in the ground, and for taller posts, we probably need them even a little bit deeper. 5 or more foot. And we also really want concrete under the posts. It's basically a collar of concrete we want. So one of the things I do see is people will make a nice 4-foot hole and then they'll pour concrete. They'll put the post in and then they'll pour the concrete from there all the way up to the dirt. And that's not actually what we want to do when we're putting this concrete in. I know that's a big piece of concrete and that makes you feel better. But what we really need is the concrete only to be at the bottom of that hole, below the frost level. And we need actually a fairly wide opening at the bottom. So we want to put a lot of concrete down there, but we want it low in the ground, and then we want the dirt on top of it to hold that concrete in the ground. That collar basically resists the upward force. It makes a big surface area so that the whole thing can't lift out. It's the same as putting, has anyone ever put a post in the ground and poured concrete all the way to the top versus putting a post in the ground with concrete at the bottom and then putting dirt on top of it and tamping it in? If you try and pull out that post and it's concrete to the top, it's a pain in the butt. If you try and do it and you've properly set the concrete at the bottom and then you've tamped your dirt on top of it, you won't be able to pull it up. Same concept here. Best of all, please, please, please do not put it like 6 or 12 inches in the ground because you hit rock. That's really not a good solution, but I see a lot of it. And that's what it looks like when it pops out there. That's not a good sign. And that's another uplift post-withdrawal. One of the things I will say is I had a tornado hit my farm last year, and we properly set all of our posts, and even properly set, I can see where all of my posts lifted about a ½ inch on one side of my barn. But because they had proper collars on them, I have torques on my hoops and things like that, but I did not lose my posts. Over 100-mile-an-hour winds. The other thing we can do to protect ourselves from winds is bracing. And there's a lot of different types of bracing you should be seeing in a pole barn, excuse me. We should see bracing here especially if we have sidewalls open. We should have this type of bracing, braced in two directions at the post. That's designed so that we don't have too much load going on these top plates so that we get bowing in our plates. And the reason why we need this is because we typically try to make these openings as large as possible, and we take about half of the posts out on the sidewall where we're bringing in and out all of our equipment and our hay. And this is what secures up these top plates to keep them from breaking. We use this X bracing here to protect us from shifting as wind loads become uneven. We have knee braces here that go up to the top cord. These are also designed to handle wind loads within the space and keep the barn square to itself. These corner ones are critical for keeping square structures. They're also really useful when your hay falls into that back corner, which it inevitably will. And then, of course, you want X bracing as well on your end wall as well as in your middle of your barn. So lots of bracing you should be seeing. If you're not seeing someone coming in and installing bracing when they're installing a pole barn, you should be questioning why they're not doing that for you. It doesn't cost much money, and if they tell you that you have to buy a couple more pieces of wood, you should be buying more pieces of wood to get that done. Am I doing okay? I'm running a little late. Okay. The reason we ventilate the barns is to remove moisture. Hay does not come in completely dry. Respiration generates moisture. Moisture migrates within stacks of hay. Condensation and drip from metal barns will also come back down into your stack of hay within a barn. So we have a moisture we need to handle. And in order to do that, we need ventilation within our barns. Ventilation principles, the concept here is that we let our air come in somewhere low on the side of the barns, and then we have some sort of opening at the top to let the air out. On pole barns, we do need some sort of covered ridge cap in order to have that happen. If our barn is more than 70 feet long, we need to have some form of a ridge opening. If our barn is only 62 foot, we can probably get away without it, but it's always better to have one. That's sort of an example of a ridge vent for an enclosed barn. And we need some sort of eave opening, something on the sidewall to allow that fresh air in. The other thing I will say is that especially on hoop barns I see this, but also sometimes on the metal-sided pole barns, there needs to be a little bit of an opening at the bottom of the barn because that heat and generation, it's gonna, if we can bring in cool air right at the bottom, it's gonna come up all the way through the stack of hay. So a lot of people are afraid to leave some openings down near the floor of the barn, but that's really useful for trying to get the air movement through the full stack of hay. So for example, on a barn like this, I might put one piece of metal down the side, but I wouldn't put two pieces and drop it all the way to the ground. That would be too much enclosure on the side of a barn. Any questions?
When you were talking about setting posts with the concrete column,
Yeah.
we built a barn in Virginia at the research station, and it was pretty well engineered, I thought. But they actually drove pieces of rebar, drilled those posts out, put pieces of rebar, and poured concrete around the bottom of the post.
Yes. Yes. So if you put rebar through the bottom or some sort of attachment on the bottom of it, they also make things that you can sit the post into that stick out on the sides so that when you pour the concrete can slip away from or crack away from a wood post, especially a square wood post, because it doesn't attach well. The rebar will work its way further out into the concrete, and it will really ensure that if there's a heaving motion occurring, that the concrete's going to hold it down. Yeah. So, and the rebar should be, maybe 9 or 12 inches from the bottom of the post. Anything else? Yes, sir. So on the hoop barn, it's not so bad because typically, as long as we have maybe like say 5 or 6 foot on our sidewall, we can, 6 foot for sure on the sidewall for a 5x6 bale. You should be able to get them in. You can't barrel stack and do it. You won't have the height for that. But because of the shape of it, you can usually get them in. I wouldn't want to go a lot taller than say like 8 foot because they're not usually engineered to take a wind load a lot taller than that. And already at the center of that, you're already 20-some feet in the air. So I would say 6 foot would be a pretty safe number to be out of the ground. 8 foot if you can find the right size post to do it, but I wouldn't really go a lot taller than that. Plus, you know, it's harder to manage to get the hoops up then. Yeah. It's not so much that the wind is the problem, it's that the attachments going from the metal post down into the wood structure are not necessarily sized for the load, the upward force that they're getting from the wind. When wind comes through, wind at ground level is like 0, and wind at 4 foot's like 2, and then wind at 6 feet is like, or at 3 it's at 2, at 6 feet it's at like 7. So that it's an exponential growth in the amount of wind speed you get with height. So the higher we get off the ground where that attachment point is, the more upward force is coming off of those attachments. It's not likely that the post is what's coming out of the ground. It's the attachment mechanism that's probably going to be challenged, which is a lag, so it's not particularly designed.
Okay, let's